All right, so I'm going to share with you all a number of things in this presentation, and I'm going to push your thinking. Okay? A mind stretched to new dimensions never goes back to its original shape. All right? So I'm going to share with you all a number of personal stories, and I know many of you I've had the privilege of spending personal time with, which, thank you, good to see many of you again, even though it's been a year. I didn't lose more hair, by the way. I didn't have it before. So I'm going to share with you a number of things that are the results of the schools that I visited, the districts I visited, the schools that I visited outside of the United States, especially a story I'll share with you all of the school that I went to in Johannesburg, South Africa, which I'm looking forward to going back again. It's a whole nother thing to share with you all. And it all ties in with some of what was shared this morning, as well as even with Micah yesterday in regards to education as an institution and learning as a system. And so I used these first two pictures. I'm going to share these with you all because I actually spoke at a school in Miami. It was actually in Broward County back in January. And there's an area of Miami called Winslow Walls and Winslow Doors. And it's cool because it's an area where, here's one for you all, terminology. What's the difference between street art and graffiti? The zip code. That is street art to me. And I captured this one and this one because it reminded me of how a lot of times what we do as individuals in our participation in society, and then also us as individuals in our participation in education, there are a lot of things that occur and exist that we aren't aware of. And it's one of the first things I do now when I do some of my workshops with teachers on race and culture in schools, is because I always tell teachers, there are a lot of things that exist in your curriculum that you aren't even aware of. And they are specifically there for a reason, just like we already just heard. And so what my goal with this is to get you all to broaden your perspective, and I want to lift you out of the forest so that you can have an eagle-eyed view of what's going on, which is why we consistently see some of the inequities that exist now that existed even back when I was in school. And I'm going to guess, looking around this room and having opportunities to have conversations with many of you, existed even when you were in school. I'm not going to ask you to age yourself, though, because we're all family here. So I always have this as a slide for some of my presentations as a reminder to the point that you already heard this morning, that some of the systems that are in place are specifically designed to stratify society, stratify our students, and therefore when they finish, in many cases, in fact, here's one. Here's a recent book that I read. It's a great book. What's the grade level that constitutes the highest degree of black and brown male students being suspended or expelled? Anyone want to guess? I got a 7th and I got an 8th. Say it again? I got a 3rd. Y'all ready? Because you know you're about to get shocked, right? Preschool. Bingo. Preschool. Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu. That's the author. He's got several books. Preschool. Think about it. Preschool is optional. What is the demographic of most preschool teachers? And you notice I said the demographic of the students. And the reason why I share that with you all is it ties into this, because in many cases there are things that happen in school that are the predictors of student success. Those factors are things that we as educators don't necessarily have direct control over. But we do have control over the interactions we have with our students, the relationships we build. And so I'm going to share with you all at least one strategy that I used when I was in school that not only did I find it to be extremely useful and valuable, I was a speaker for a friend of mine. He does an online conference, and I shared some of that, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from other educators on Twitter who started doing that. So I'm going to take you all through that activity right now. If you will go to that web address, and please take it should take you no more than about 30 to 45 seconds to complete that Google form. And I apologize, it is case sensitive. All right, we'll go back to this later. Thank you all very much. And you see how much time that took. Now just imagine if I had my agenda posted on a website that you go to every day. There's just one quick link that you could do. Keep that in mind when I bring it up later. Now, I used to call what we're going to do right now, this presentation, this. I used to call it Generation Now, 21st Century Teaching and Learning with Technology. Then I realized a couple of things. One, we're in 2019, ladies and gentlemen. It's no longer 21st century. We shouldn't be using that terminology. Okay? You know what else? Especially for all of you here. You got access. You're getting access. You're working on access. Technology should no longer be the whipped cream on the sundae. We get the whole sundae all at once as a part of our learning. And so I changed the whole thing to contemporary teaching and learning. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, it means these two big areas for us as educators. We want to be both responsive and relevant, because if you are not responsive, you are not relevant. What do I mean by that? Responsive means that we are taking in information, whether it's numerical data, whether it's qualitative data, interactions, conversations, information. We process that. We make adjustments as we go as educators. As you all know, learning is not static, it's dynamic. Not every student is the same. Not every class is the same. Teach the same subject through 7 periods. Not all 7 periods are going to be the same. Not at all. So, how can we be more responsive and more relevant, and why is that important for us as educators, and why do I use those two as the identifiers for being a contemporary educator? Because of the following. So, I'm going to turn back the clock and take you all through a couple of things. That right there represents the totality of access to learning that I had growing up. How many of you had Encyclopedia Britannica? If your hand isn't up, you're lucky. Good for you. The reason why I share this as a start is because the only access I had to information was what was put in those books. They were only as good as the most updated version of those books that you had. The quality of that information was only as good as who was writing it. See where I'm going with that? So, I use this as an example for a couple of things. When you have students working with technology, please, 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 do not dissuade them from using Wikipedia. It is different now. It's not like it was when I first started teaching tech, where anyone could go in, you could edit something, and it was never vetted. Okay? Think about how much content is on Wikipedia. You know, that's arguably the 3rd most used website on the entire web. Anyone want to guess what number 1 is? Google. Guess what's number 2? You're going to find out more about that one later. YouTube. Okay? So the reason why I share this also is because if we are still using antiquated sources of information for our students, that information is not only unresponsive, in many cases it is irrelevant. I even just saw on Twitter some educators were posting some stuff because, you know, it's February, so that means we got to change the curriculum. Okay? And one of them said that she didn't even realize that Texas was the very last state to emancipate slaves. And so I posted, and I'm like, yeah, you never heard of Juneteenth? And she's like, no, they didn't teach that to us in school. Where were you learning from? Anyone want to guess where her primary mechanism of learning history in school was? Somebody just said it. The textbook. So that's why I want to ask you all this first question to kind of share at your table. When it comes to you as a school leader, you as a coach, and even you as a teacher, when you do an analysis of your curriculum, remember I'm lifting y'all up above the forest to kind of take a look at things. When you do an analysis of your curriculum, could you say unequivocally that this applies to the curriculum that you have designed and the learning opportunities for your students? Because as we've heard, you hear a lot, equity is the new buzzword, it's a shiny new thing. Most people don't really know what equity is. That's one example of how it ties in with the curriculum. Is the curriculum designed so that no matter who you are, no matter what you identify with, you can participate fully? That is being responsive. That is also being relevant. Next one, talk about textbooks. Let me share with you all a couple of things about textbooks. The textbooks, you all know, I'm sure some of you in this room probably do. You know what the process is for a textbook to be developed, designed, published, and implemented? Do you all know that process? Some of you are shaking your head, yes. I don't see a lot of yeses. Ultimately, what's the first state to adopt textbooks? California second. Somebody just said it. Texas. So if I'm a textbook publisher, am I going to design a textbook to meet the needs of the students in California, or am I going to do it for Texas? And it's not a knock on Texas per se, but it is a knock on if we utilize the textbooks as our primary mechanism of learning and source of information for our students. There are plenty of examples. All you got to do is do a YouTube search, and you could find them, where there is information that is either sanitized or skewed in the textbook. And the reason why I share all this with you all is I'm going to ask you a couple of questions next, is because I believe one of the most equitably accessible locations on any school at any time is the library. That's the one place where every one of us should be able to go to a school and go into the library and find a book that we can either relate to the author or the protagonist on a race, gender, or cultural level. And I remember when I was in school, and this is why I talk about how some of the things have not changed. When I was in school, what did I do with my remote? Oh, here we go. When I was in school, I remember a couple of things. So for me growing up, and I believe I shared this with some of you all last year, my freshman year of high school, my dad specifically told me, I only want you taking honors and AP classes. You don't take none of those other classes. I come from a family of educators, okay? My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, was born in 1919, had 9 siblings. Rural Alabama, had family from Leeds and Camden, Alabama. All 10 of them went to college. Keep in mind where she grew up, keep in mind when she was born. My grandfather, okay, his side of the family, they immigrated from the Carolinas to Ohio. They knew how important education was. And it's interesting because I was just looking at today's date in history. My grandfather went to Tennessee State University. If you don't know the importance of today's date, February 13th, was the day that the first student protest in Tennessee that was a catalyst for the sit-ins, okay? That's where he went to school, okay? So the reason why I share all this with you is, one, I only took honors and AP classes in school. Do you think I learned any of this stuff in school? In those classes? Absolutely not. Number two, as it ties in with the texts and the books that we make accessible to our students, I'll never forget. I'm 48 years old, soon to be 49, and I remember this like it was last week. And this is what happens. This is why we want to be cognizant of the terminology we use and the interactions we have with our students, regardless of their age, because I'm going to tell you something that happened to me when I was 16 years old, and as I just told you, I'm 48 years old now. AP American Lit. We're reading The Glass Menagerie. How many of you have read that book? Decent number of us in the room, few of us, okay? That's considered one of the classics, Tennessee Williams. If you've read the book, then you know there is nothing I can relate to the author or the story on a race or a culture level at all. And I'll never forget asking the teacher, AP American Lit teacher, who I actually liked him, by the way, as I said, hey, I know we're reading The Glass Menagerie, but I also want to read Langston Hughes, and not in February. And you know what the response I got was? We don't have time to get to that because that's not part of the curriculum. It's not the classics. And so the reason why I share that with all of you is a lot of the things that are part of our institution of education are not only specifically designed to perpetuate a particular narrative, they exclude many of the narratives, the positives, the stories, the representations of every one of the students that are in your school or in your classroom. And so that's why I would ask you these questions. If you were to keep score in the library or in your personal, wherever students have access to reading, what would be your scorecard for representation? How many books could any one of your students go in and find representation where the characters are in the readings, diversity of the characters, or even when it comes to representation of the authors and the works that are used? How about you yourself? If you go into your classroom, or if you're a school leader, if you go into your library, can you find representation that is aligned with your culture, your race, or your gender? All of these things that I'm sharing with you, which I have a few more, are how we can make sure that the curriculum is equitably accessible to all of our students. Okay, that's equity, the access aspect. So I'm gonna export these slides and you all have access to these, but that's why I wanted to ask you all some of these questions, got more. Here's another component to that. And this is all, by the way, this is all in line with being a culturally responsive educator. It's a culturally responsive curriculum. If you think about the books that you have access to, even the books you've read, How many of them? Social situations and problems are not seen as individual problems, but are situated within a societal context. Don't blame the person, blame the society or blame the system, okay? How many are like that? Problems faced by people of color or females are not resolved through the benevolent intervention of a white person or a male. And I'm not being filtered with what I'm sharing with you all. You know what the catchphrase is for what I just shared with you? That's reading books of which the protagonist is identified with the white savior complex. What does that do to a student? We're adults. I know what it does to me. What does it do to a student that the only representations that they read and they learn from says that the only way I can be rescued from my conditions is from a person who doesn't look like me, a person who can't relate to me, and that's my only pathway? What does that do to them when it comes time for a sense of belonging at school, a sense of a relationship with any of the teachers at your schools, you as an educator? And then the last one was another one. Diverse ethnicities and nationalities are portrayed. Not all Asian families are Chinese, and not all Latinx families are Mexican. That's why I said I'm gonna get y'all thinking. This stuff matters. I cannot stress it enough. I had a privilege to visit many of your schools, but every time I go and visit a school, I did some race and culture work with Albemarle County Public Schools back in November. If you don't know where Albemarle County is, it's in Virginia. If you don't know what city is in Albemarle County, I will tell you, and this is why I went, Charlottesville. I'm sure you all know what happened in Charlottesville not too long ago, okay? So they called Ken, said, we need you to come in. We want to do this. We need to be better. We need to do better. And I specifically started talking about the representation. First place I always ask to go, can I go in the library? I went in the library and looked. You want to know the cool thing that they did at Albemarle High School, at the high school rather? The entrance to the library, I should have had a picture that I could show you. They showed us a big sign, and they had the name of every single teacher, and they changed it every month, by the way, so keep in mind what kind of culture this is. Every teacher had a picture of the book that they were reading for that month. And here's the catch. Every one of those books that the teachers were reading were from the school library. And they even did a thing where they had a poster up because there was a group, there was the AP English teacher and almost the entire 11th grade English department. All the kids were slated to read, which they started back in December, The Hate You Give. They were going to read that and then watch the film. I'm like, when you watch the film, call me, add me to Google Classroom. I want to communicate and converse with the kids on that as they start to break down that story and the cultural meaning behind that story. Are you all familiar with that, yes? If you're not, I cannot stress enough. It's a great book. That is a good book for especially high school juniors and seniors to read, for sure. I would even start it off with 9th graders personally. But anyway, continuing on. This is my favorite one, the dreaded worksheet. So I have found, and if this exists for you, please don't take this as an indictment on what you're doing. I'm from the perspective of raise awareness and be constructive rather than destructive. I have found, sadly, that when I go to most schools that I go to, when I have the opportunity to witness and observe what the kids are doing with the curriculum, and they have the technology access, I can draw along a specific race and even gender line which kids are encouraged and given the opportunity to do creative learning, and which group of kids are given drill and kill and repetitive task-oriented stuff. And the reason why I share that with all of you as well is because there are ways now that people looked at learning and they said, okay, what exists now that existed when I was in school, and how can I monetize a solution for that? And I have this as an example because every time one of my daughters comes home with a worksheet from school, she's like, Daddy, I'm going to use my phone. I'm like, okay, go for it. You know what she does? She has photo math. If you're not familiar with photo math, if I'm a student in a math class and I get sent home with a worksheet that's like this, all I got to do is take a picture of each problem and give me the answer like that. And if I have to show my work, I push a button, it'll show me how it's calculated. Okay? That's one way. And why did that app exist? Because the developer saw, okay, here's something that existed when I was in school and I hated it. Here's a way that I know it's not going to change. So here's how I can monetize it. That's actually my kind of thinking. Okay? What I encourage math teachers to do And I say, if you know that that exists and you know that kids are going to try to do something that is not mundane and task-oriented, why not take advantage of that? How can we be more responsive to that and therefore make that learning more relevant? One of the things I encourage math teachers to do is use the app. Say, here's how it's calculated. Now, figure out another way to calculate that answer. Which one is the most efficient? Okay? Why did it calculate it this way when you might have found a different way? And then the other thing with math that I have found, especially, I did a long-term math assignment in my early career with LA Unified, is I didn't realize I was actually doing this with the students in math because they hated math. And I don't understand why kids hate math. To me, math is, I mean, I'll talk a little bit more about math in a moment, but this is another one. Guidance is provided on making real-life connections between academic content and the local neighborhood, culture, environment, and resources. I remember I was teaching algebra. Kids were like, Mr. Shelton, I hate math. I'm like, no, math is great. I'm like, no, I hate it. I'm like, you don't understand. I can tell you that you can write something in English and I can tell you it's wrong, but I can't tell you you calculated an answer incorrect because 2 + 2 is going to be 4 no matter where you go. I'm like, why don't we figure out a way to bridge what you don't know with numbers, what you need to know with numbers, and how it's relevant to you? I started having the students do, I didn't even have the terminology then, but a social justice lens approach to math. So you know what I had the kids do? Real talk, local content. I said, okay, when you walk home, I want you to count how many liquor stores there are on each block on your way home. And I want you also to count how many military recruitment centers there are. Okay? Nothing wrong with it yet. I had the students do that. And I said, now let's see if we can identify an algebraic equation that's aligned with that. And then now after we do that, why don't we do a couple of searches using, back then it was a MapQuest. I said, let's see how many liquor stores there are per block in, I don't know, let's try a zip code 90210. If you don't know what that zip code is, it's Beverly Hills. And of course now, ding. So it's like, wait a minute, that's not right. And I'm like, okay, now let's talk. Who controls that? What does that process look like? Kids started learning about zoning. They started learning about all these things. But the connection was, this is your community, this is what you're exposed to, and this is the content we need to learn. So I'm going to do whatever I can to bridge that so it means something to you. And I've actually had some teachers tell me, well, you shouldn't have done that. You know, that's not right, having them look at liquor stores. I'm like, you didn't work where I work. You don't work where I work. So don't tell me what I should or should not have done. In the end, all of those students understood the importance of math beyond just simply what you could find on a worksheet. They understood the importance of math when it comes to zoning laws. They understood the importance of math as to what gets allocated where and why. And I remember telling them, like, now you see why math is important. Now let's shift into the other reasons why it's important between having a bank account, I mean, of course, back then, balancing your checkbook. What happens if you make $100 and I tell you, keep 50 and put 50 away? Now, what does compounding interest look like? If you put $50 away at the age of 15 and you get only 3% interest for the next 50 years, how much money are you going to have? And yet all you did was sacrifice 50 right now. See that? Context. We have to be able to bridge what do my kids need to learn and what is their environment like so that it makes contextual sense to them. That's one of the biggest challenges. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you all it's easy because it's not. But if we mean well and we're purposeful in doing it, it will be the connection that our students will make with us, and that'll be the difference between being the predictor of success and not. And so that leads me to the next one. How many of you like multiple choice tests? Good, no one's hand went up. Okay? I'll share with you all two things about multiple choice tests. Number one, when I graduated from high school, I scored 750 on math on the SAT, 550 on the verbal. And I'll never forget this. I heard it's changing, but I'll believe it when I see it, because ultimately the questions I ask is when you look at certain tests that are standardized, who's writing the test, who's at the table when those questions are determined and decided on, and then what are the standards of measurement that they're using to identify the quality of that test? Because I know I'm not there. And I remember taking the SAT, and I remember getting some questions on, where you had to do the analogies, where you had a word and a colon and another word, and you had to identify the relationship and the answer. And I remember having a bunch of questions on what's it like on a farm. At 17 years old, I had never ever set foot on a farm. So that's why back then it was known, and it's still even known to some degree, that some of the tests are culturally irrelevant. They are unresponsive. How do we bridge that for ourselves? Well, one, how much learning does a multiple choice test really gauge? The good students figured out the game. And it took me, by the way, when I was teaching and when I got full time, it took me 3 to 4 years to actually figure a lot of these things out. So I'm not going to tell you that, oh, Ken had it right the first time. No, I didn't. You know what one of the ways I started figuring it out was? I started talking with the students. Tell me what this means to you. Is this the best way for you to learn? Does this make sense? Am I doing right by your opportunity for learning? Should I be making adjustments? How can I be different? How can we be better? How can we learn together? It's amazing what you find out when you actually just talk to students. Okay? And so that's why I tie in with this, because ultimately when you think about the curriculum, does it present different points of view on the same event or experience, especially points of view from marginalized people or communities? How many voices are missing from the opportunities that our students have to learn? Diverse student identities are seen as assets and strengths that can advance individual and group learning rather than seen as challenges or difficulties to be overcome. Most students don't want to be told that they're less than, that they're incapable of, that they can't. How many of you in this room were told that when you were growing up? I can tell you my hand is up because I was. Okay, only a few of us. Good. So hopefully that number goes down then. Because I was told, rewinding back to the story I shared with you all in high school, I was told by my high school counselor. In fact, I just had my 30-year reunion back in October, and I confirmed some of the stuff that I remember with some of my classmates. I was told by my high school counselor my freshman year, 2 weeks into the school year, I'm doing an audit of classes, and I see that you have all these honors and AP classes. Yes, my dad told me to take those. Those aren't for you. That's what she told me. I was 14 years old. I remember it like it was last week. Now, of course, I was left with, do I do what the counselor says or do I do what my dad says? Counselor's going to lose 100% of the time. But you know what the unintended consequence of her doing that was? For my entire high school years, all 4, I was the only non-white student in all of my honors and AP classes. Now, go to the story I just shared with you about American Lit. How many times did Mr. Loomer hear from a student that I want to read Langston Hughes? My guess is only when I brought it up. And that's why representation is important. And I understand for those of you that are school leaders, you cannot control who applies. Because I can tell you all, K through 20, it was my sophomore year in college. He's now the president, I believe, at Claremont College. I only had one African-American male teacher. Sophomore year in college, my sociology professor, Dr. Oliver. And you all have probably seen some of the research and some of the stories around representation. It matters. If kids don't see success in what looks like them, then they're not as likely to see it in themselves. And that's why I share all these things, because if you can't control who is physically in the classroom, you can control how diversity is represented. And that's what ties in with equity. Does the curriculum provide access? Does it provide representation? Can you look at it and say, there are representations of me that I identify with on a positive level that I can relate to, and I'm hearing other stories as well. So the last one I want to share with you all as far as being culture responsive is this. And this is a tough one, because a lot of times we don't know the answer to this. The materials that teachers use, who are the authors of those? Who's at the table when those decisions are made? And you know how we go around a lot of these things? You all have already started doing it. Technology. If you have access with technology, that democratizes representation, and it democratizes information. Yes, it creates a whole nother stream of skills that students need to have, which I'll touch on those shortly, because it's not just simply, oh, go on the internet and find this and do that. It doesn't work that way. Kids need to be meaningful and responsible digital citizens. They also need to understand how to navigate the internet. You'd be surprised to find out a lot of kids, they think they know, but they don't really know. They're just not afraid to go and try. So what I want to leave you all real quick is I'll ask you all a question. I'll give you all a minute. Based on what I just shared in regards to representation and curriculum, please at your table take about a minute and kind of share your thoughts around that as it pertains to access and equity, please. Okie dokie. I'm sorry we only had 1 minute, but I sincerely hope in the time that you all are here together, you're able to continue the conversations along the lines with this, because I do have a couple more questions to share with you all towards the end. So part of being responsive and relevant is also understanding what goes on with the activities that our kids can do, and that quite frankly we do, on the internet. That is an updated infographic from 2018. They haven't released the 2019 one yet. That's what happens every 60 seconds on the internet. That's a lot of stuff going on there. How about this one? What's the, I believe I asked this to you all last year, and guess what? It's still the case. You all know what the #1 platform your kids use as far as social media goes is? It's Snapchat. Still. You know that they're having more interaction with their classmates on Snapchat than they are in the hallways of your schools. You know what's #2 for kids? Instagram. Instagram. They don't use Facebook. They think Facebook is for old folks. They don't use it. Okay? You know what else is meaningful? That's why I isolate these. There's a reason why I have these 4 isolated out of that entire infographic. Those 4 represent the top 4 things that your students do, whether it's interacting with their classmates or, wait for it, finding information. And that's why digital citizenship is critical for us as educators and for our students as being good digital citizens and understanding how to navigate content on the internet, because they're constantly doing it. I don't have it in this talk, but I have another talk where a friend of mine, his son and daughter, in school, the school just kept sending home homework. And I could share with you all how I feel about homework, but let's just say I hate it. Okay, so, and I will tell you, real talk, the reason why I hate it is because if every time you send something home with a student, that is under a very dangerous assumption that all of your students have access to the same financial and human resources to do the work. And I've seen it. I'm gonna be vulnerable. I made that mistake for the first 4 years I was in the classroom. Because when I was in my credential program, that's how I was taught. I was told, you need to do this, and this, and this. And I'll never forget having an argument with one of my professors, because I was one of those students, because when we had to read and do all of our studies on classroom management, and it was like you remember there's a spectrum, you're either freewheeling or big-time authoritarian. And I'm like, hey, professor, her name was Dr. Semrau. I'm like, Dr. Semrau, I have a problem with what you're assigning us to read. And she's like, why? I'm like, none of these authors have worked in a K through 12 school. None of these authors look like me. None of these authors look like the students I work with. So that's not relevant to what I'm doing right now on a daily basis. Speaking of books, if anyone here has read it, you can be my testament. Cannot strongly recommend this book enough, especially for us. Dr. Beverly Tatum, Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria? If you don't know it, buy it. I have a whole list of other books I could recommend. I read a lot. That one for sure. Okay? The reason why I have this here is because going back to that, what I was sharing with that story, is my friend, his son and daughter were constantly coming home with work. You know what? And they got tired of the homework. They looked across the room. Granted, it requires access, but they looked across the room. My dad has a Google Home here. Anyone here familiar with Google Home or an Alexa? You know what you could do with that? Guess what they did? Started asking Google Home for all the answers. Done. So, do you hold them responsible for asking Google Home? Or is it maybe we don't want to give students those types of assignments? Or, going back to what I shared before, be careful about the homework. Be careful about the homework. I saw the collateral damage from me assigning homework. I saw the kids that couldn't do it and became more frustrated. And I'm like, you need to do your homework. And I mark them down. Then they get angry with me. And then I realize, I'm like, well, wait a minute, why aren't you doing your homework? And then, of course, who's going to help me at home? Boom. I felt terrible. Now, sometimes we find out some of the things we do, we think we're doing the right thing, you find out, no, it's not the right thing. I felt awful. And I vowed to myself, I looked in the mirror and I'm like, I will never, ever do this again as long as I'm in the classroom. Never. And yes, I had parents like, you should be sending home homework. Nah, I'm not going to do that. If you want your child to do something, put them in extracurricular activity. Not going to do it. Can't do it. Won't do it. So I share this with all of you also because most of your students are going to YouTube especially. You want to know what the most popular search on YouTube is? How to, and fill in the blank. Bingo. Yeah. You'd be surprised. In fact, I got one for you. We're going to do an activity shortly. How many of you have learned something on YouTube in the last month? How about last week? How about today? I just looked up a couple of things, which I'll share with you all shortly. Yeah. That's what they're doing. So rather than have students go on YouTube to learn something, how about having them author something to put on YouTube to teach one of their classmates? If you're going to do work that doesn't involve them being physically on your campus, how about having them do something like that that their classmates can then learn from themselves, from each other? That's collaboration to me. Hey, I got something cool I want to share with all of you. I'm going to put it on YouTube. Now everyone can watch video. Okay? So I'm going to show you two examples of what happens when learning is not accessible, but there's not going to be a barrier to that learning. And here's one example. Having a boom box, you go to the park, you put the linoleum down, you crank up the tunes. Back then it was KRS-One, Grandmaster Flash. What's the likelihood that you all think that breakdancing or even dance in general, let's go in general, is accessible to these kids at their school? And this is something that this is one fight I will never give up. Because every time a school is having some degree of struggles, if you will, when it comes to achievement, the first areas that usually get snipped are what? The arts. We should have more arts. I don't have any art teachers here because usually I get a clap with that. But you all get my point, though, is that, okay, if we don't have the program, how can we make that type of content accessible and perhaps bridge the gap between what is the history of breakdancing? You know, I love it where I see, are you all familiar with gumshoe dancing? You all heard of that? And things like the Blue Man Group. You know the history behind that? Here's another one they don't teach you in school. If you look up the history of gumshoe dancing and like what the Blue Man Group does with sound, with anything, that goes all the way back to South African diamond mines. Because that's how the enslaved, if you want to call it, or the workers who were enslaved, that's how they communicated in the mines. They used rhythm, and they told when people are coming. All the way back to South Africa. How many kids who like that kind of music or like doing that even know that? Okay? Again, it's bridging something for our kids. Now, here's another example, and then I will share with you all something that is important in regards to these videos. In this example, nearest dojo is 4 hours away, but I have such a passion for jiu-jitsu, I'm going to figure out another way to learn it. I got a partner, collaboration, and we're going to do it together. We're going to practice a move, and we're going to look at the video, and then we're going to go over and over and over and over. My point in sharing this with all of you is this is all under the category of what I identify as called micro-learning. I need to learn something now, I want to learn it quick, and I know where I can find access to do that. The question I would ask all of you is, the next time you have a conversation with a student, ask them, what's the most recent micro-learning lesson that they've had, and where did they go to find it? And you already probably know one of the #1 platforms is going to be YouTube. Now, I'm not here to say that YouTube will ever replace a teacher, because it won't. You all have already heard from other speakers, and even Micah mentioned it yesterday, in regards to the value and the importance of relationships. I had an interesting conversation with some educators about YouTube. They're like, nope, YouTube is that. And I'm like, no. Because I go back to Malcolm Gladwell with Tipping Point, 10,000 hours. You know, it's the whole concept. You put in 10,000 hours of something and you become an expert. What if you do 10,000 hours wrong? Okay? So this is just looking at learning from a standpoint of what is accessible, where do our students go, why do they go to these platforms? One, is highly visual, okay? And number two, it's if they have access, it's highly accessible. And they can kind of control a little bit of what they want to do. Yes, as educators, we can provide the framework around that. I remember back before I had to leave the classroom, I used to tell students, I'm like, I'm teaching you a particular way. If you want, go on YouTube and see if you can find an alternate way. Bottom line is, there's the finish line. How we get to that finish line, I have a path, but what I'm teaching you is not the path. There could be other ways. Let's figure them out together, okay? So the reason why I share all that with you is one of the websites I love to have students go to is called Instructables. And I have them go there, and I'm like, go and look at something that's being taught there. And yes, you could find almost anything on here. So I'll go back to my reference to math. There's some cool stuff on there where they even have a thing on where students can learn how to make algebra blocks. If y'all ever seen algebra blocks, there's the x and x squared and so on. There's even a lesson on how to make those. I'm like, okay, have students go do that. There's your makerspace. Because you know what makerspace was when I was growing up? Shop class. How many shop classes exist now, sadly? I love shop class. I had wood, electric, metal, and drafting. Drafting was one of my favorites. Technical drawing, I loved it, okay? The key here is not so much do you want students to go there to learn the lesson. To me, it's how can I have students go here and author a lesson and then use that as an alternate form of assessment. Now you're saying, okay, you have tech, we want you to use it, we want you to be a strong digital citizen, and by the way, I want you to author something so that when you're older, you can say, yeah, I put something on the internet that I'm proud of and that's meaningful because it's something that was related to what I was learning. That was one of my goals back when I was in the classroom. Every student that I had in the 8th grade, if they had me in the 7th grade, when they had me in 8th grade, I said, your goal this year is to be published, period. We'll figure out where and what, but you're going to be published. I had students author designs for the Noun Project. Y'all familiar with the Noun Project? If you're not, it's actually pretty amazing. It's just icons. But I was teaching them Adobe Illustrator, okay? That's one. Another one is something like Instructables. A good friend of mine, his website is nextvista.org. It's all instructional videos. Like, we'll do that. We'll use that as your form of assessment. And by the way, you will be published. That was their motivation. If you're going to do it and you're going to want to be on the web, then let's have you be on the web and build a strong digital presence that's meaningful. Alternate form of assessment, not multiple choice tests. So, continuing on, just for time's sake, because I was going to have you all go through an exercise, but just for the sake of skipping past it, I was going to challenge you all to find two things. One was to find a video on Instructables or on YouTube that is an alternate way to tie your shoes. Those videos exist, which is pretty cool. And then I was going to have you go on Instructables and look up that video I just shared with you on how to design algebra blocks. Try doing that with students. Just get blocks. Say, we need to design these. What do we call this? I forgot. Manipulatives. Thank you. To be able to use in class. What materials do we need? Who wants to do the initial designs? Who wants to be the author of the content based on what you see? How would we assess that? All of those things. So what's next along with what I'm sharing, and these are the following things, and I'll kind of zip through these just for time's sake, and that is looking at the importance of skills over content. And the reason why I say this is, yes, content has an importance, but how many of you remember what you were taught in 4th or 5th grade, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th grade? If you need to remember something from that, where are you likely to go? Okay? So for me, it's looking at the skills that we want our students to have. So I've read a lot. I read a lot. And one of the things that I did was I looked at articles from Fast Company, from Forbes, from Upwork, and several other sites, from LinkedIn. And they were looking at what are some of the skills that employers are looking for now. Keep in mind, now is already outdated for students in your schools to some degree. But what I try to do is essentially aggregate all of the things that I kept seeing over and over and over and over and over again. And those skills included all of the following. So one was negotiating skills. So here's a challenge for school administrators in the room. And believe it or not, it's something I used to do. Yes, it takes time. But it was one of the best processes I could have done when I was in the classroom. I had students negotiate for their grades. I have to give you a grade, which I hate grades. They're often punitive and arbitrary. But because I have to give you a grade, we're going to assess where you are now. And then based on either the unit or the projects we do, what was your growth in learning? And then now let's talk in regards to what is a letter representation of that. I didn't do the 0 to 100 scale. That's not equitable. It's wrong. Negotiate. You know what it got the students to do? Reflect more on their learning, identify their strengths, identify deficits that they needed filled, that I, in many cases, could support. Got them doing higher order thinking skills. I'm thinking about thinking. I'm more cognitive of my learning. Now I have to have a conversation with Mr. Shelton about if I have to put a letter equivalent to that, what is that letter going to be? It's fascinating to do that. Try it. Try it. And you all have access to technology. If you have access to Google Apps, I had Google Calendar, set up appointment slots. And then when I knew the grading period was on, I said, we got 3 weeks. And at my last school, my average class size, as was mentioned earlier, class size, I had average class size of 45 on a 7-period day. But here's the thing, didn't matter because it was important for me to talk to the students. They had to learn how to negotiate. Think about what we do as adults when we have to negotiate something and the communicative skills that are required to do that. You have to have information and a position and be able to effectively articulate that to win over something. Okay? Negotiating skills is one. Time management was another. I didn't say, okay, every student, you have to finish all of your work in 3 days. Because what happens to the students that they can finish, they'll just take a little bit longer. If you're going to take a little bit longer, why does it take you longer? How can I be supportive of that? And then how much longer is it going to take? Students, when they start to develop an awareness around their use of time, that's one of the catalysts for being effective at time management. And especially on the school day, because I know that unless you're on a block schedule, those class periods go by quick. Okay? The other one, public speaking skills. And no, it doesn't mean you have to be where I am now to talk in public. Public speaking skills is also tied in with the negotiating. I'm speaking to someone in essentially an open forum. It's not an intimate, private conversation. No, students don't have to stand up in front of their classmates to do that. But all of you are educators. Guess what you do? You do public speaking, whether it's in front of your staff, in front of your students, or in front of your school district. Required skill. The other one, research skills. That ties in with what I shared with you all earlier in regards to the use of YouTube and all those other things. How do we utilize appropriate degrees of syntax to find the information that is most credible and most useful for the need that we have at that time? You'd be surprised at how students will just sit there searching and searching and searching. I had an opportunity to do a workshop with some students, and I'm like, I had a list of things for us to find. And I'm like, tell me how many steps it takes for you to find them. And the students a lot of times were 3, 4, or 5 steps. They say, what would you say if I told you could do that in 1? They're like, oh, I want to know. Boom. It's all in how you communicate to, in this case, to the search engine. Research skills. How do I vet information? How do I assess the quality of the information? Internet is open. There's a lot out there. There's a lot out there that is wrong. We need to have the skills as educators, and more importantly, we want our students to have the skills to be able to decipher the difference between something that is useful, meaningful, and credible and something that is not. Okay? And then the last one, of course, is people and networking skills. I remember I desperately wanted to do projects with my classmates when I was in high school, and almost 100% of the time the teacher said no because you might be cheating. And yet we're all in this room together doing what? Working together. See that? People and networking skills. And I remember telling some of my students, I'm like, because they know I played college football, I'm like, did I like all of my teammates? Absolutely not. But when it came time to do what we needed to do on the field on a Saturday afternoon, we worked together. Working together doesn't require friendship. It helps, but it doesn't require friendship. And in fact, you all probably have experienced this yourself. Sometimes you shouldn't be working with your friends. Because you know what that goes back to? Time management. See that? So ultimately, all of those skills were what I had identified and aggregated, and that's why ideally for us, we can embed the content within those skills. How many times can we assess a student by saying, if you feel more confident that you could represent your learning by talking to me about what we've done, then why don't we do that? If you feel more confident that you can do it in writing, we could do that. If you have worked together in a group, what is that going to look like on how we assess that? The bottom line there is you're making learning accessible. It is equitable because you're not limiting students to one source or one stream of representation of learning. And so I share with you all kind of in conclusion here a couple of things. One is I know how it is as an educator. You go to a conference Or you go on a website because you want all these resources. Give me the resources. I want the resources. The resources will be the answer. And you want to put them in a binder and use it. I got news for you. You are the binder. There's no one answer. And the only way to know what the pathway is to know that there isn't there is a pathway. And how do we know that? By getting to know our students, by finding out what their needs are, by finding out what their learning is like, by finding out the best ways to bridge between here's what you know and here's what I know that I need you to know. So how many of you have read any Paulo Freire's books, especially Pedagogy of the Oppressed? Okay, that is a quote from one of his books. That's another book I recommend, any of his really, but Pedagogy of the Oppressed is my favorite. And again, these will be accessible to all of you because ultimately, again, when you think about relationships, I want to share with you all a couple of things. This is a conversation I hope that you all will be able to have at some point, answering those two questions. And by the way, that is aligned with being a culturally responsive educator. Now, that's my pop culture reference because ultimately education as an institution has fed us the blue pill. We want to take the red pill. All right? And so I want to share with you all, I've got those, but I'll skip past that because those will be accessible. So remember that form you all did at the very beginning? Anyone want to guess why I asked you all to do that? If you all were students of mine, that was what we did every single day, every single period in the first 60 seconds of class. Every student filled out that form that you just did. And I could show you, actually real quick, I can show you all what it looks like on the back end, and I'll explain to you the importance behind doing that. On the back end, that's what it looks like, and oh, it didn't do it correctly, darn it. Because what I used to do is this. I used to do conditional formatting. That's odd, I'll have to fix it. And so that was the back end. I would have every student fill it out every single day. You would be surprised at how much you learn about your students by doing that simple activity of when you come into class, log into your computer, go to the class website, click on the link, just fill out the form real quick for me. That way I kind of know what's going on. Because I didn't have enough time to have a conversation like I would want with every single student every single day. And I can tell you all, the feedback I've gotten from teachers and educators who have been using it is nothing short of amazing. And it really, I get goosebumps every time I get a message on Twitter in regards to that, because they're saying, a lot of educators are sharing with me how they are literally finding out stuff about their students that they had no idea what was going on. And more importantly, the students are now sharing with them, they're like, okay, here's a teacher who actually does care what I think and how I feel, and they're responsive. Going back to that, they're responsive to what my needs are. I had everything on that form from students that said, you know, I didn't get any sleep last night because a police helicopter was circling above our apartment building. Mr. Shelton, can I just put my head down for today? Yes, not a problem. We always have tomorrow. You'd be surprised at how much students share, but I don't know why I didn't do it. But you all see I had conditional formatting set up that if a certain syntax is put into a cell, it will flag it. And then I'd email that student, hey, I noticed that you marked down not good today, and you said that you need my help. Let's talk. You want to email me or do you want to step outside? Just that few minutes of making the connection with students, I can tell you right now, will make the difference between a student who will go into your schools or your classroom and feel like they matter versus a student who says, school is not for me. I don't like school. And I can share with you, I don't have time now, but I could share with you all stories of where I had to talk quite a few of my former students off the proverbial ledge because they were ready to drop out of high school because no one cared. And that leads me to one other thing I'll share with you kind of in conclusion. I had a long conversation with a friend of mine who is the director of technology for Palm Beach County Schools. Okay? Here's a challenge for all of you. Palm Beach County Schools, they were looking at culture, they were looking at race, they were looking at gender, they were looking at identity in general. They did a survey. All students in entire Palm Beach County Schools, if I remember correctly, was a couple of 100,000 students. You all are seated. You might want to sit down, Augustine. 97% of the students, 97% indicated in the survey that they didn't feel that there was a single adult at their school that actually knew them beyond just their name and a number. 97%, ladies and gentlemen. And I literally said to him, like, dude, we have a problem here. And he's like, we're addressing it. Now, what would have happened if they didn't send that survey to the students? 97%. Think about it, us as adults. If you go into something and you don't feel that someone cares about you, you don't feel that you can talk to them, you don't feel that you matter, how much are you really going to be into it? In fact, you're going to be resistant to it. And no, I'm not going to say that it's an end all to be all. Did I connect with every one of my students? No. But I went through the effort. And the sad part is, well, sad and good, I hear from former students now. I really wish I would have been able to connect with you more. I didn't realize how important you were at that time. And we're educators. You know, sometimes that happens. But if we know we're doing the right things for the right reasons, that's what makes the difference between our students feeling that they matter and that they have a sense of belonging, or them saying school is just a thing that I'm required to do, and as soon as I'm 18, I am done. Or worse, when I'm 16, I'm done. So I'll share with you all in conclusion this last thing, because that's what I identify as a recipe for being a contemporary educator, which is aligned with what I share with you all at the beginning of being both responsive and being relevant. Because all of you in this room are doing the work. Yes, I've been to plenty of schools that have more money than they know what they have to do with it. But you know what? Guess what they still lack also? Many of them. They lack the component of being a contemporary educator. They still don't have the relationships. That's what matters the most. And I just had you all go through an activity of ideally as one simple thing that you can do right now that can tell the students at your campuses and in your classrooms that they do matter and that you do care about them as an individual human being, first and foremost, before you worry about them being a learner and or a student. So I'm not going to compete against lunch anymore. I want to thank you all very much. And y'all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.